There are two of you. There is the one the world sees, the one who shows up to work on time, answers the emails, holds the door, remembers to say the right thing at dinner. And then there is the other one, the self that comes out at 2 in the morning behind a locked screen, the one who types things no colleague would recognize, who watches what you would never admit to watching, who feels the sudden ugly flash of a wish you immediately pretend you never had. By daylight you are respectable. In the dark, someone else wears your face. Most of the time you keep them apart so smoothly that you barely notice the seam. But you have felt it, the small vertigo of catching your own reflection and not being sure which one is looking back. In 1886, a sick and feverish Scotsman named Robert Louis Stevenson turned that exact vertigo into the most famous horror story ever written about being a person. He gave the two selves names, and those names became a phrase we still reach for whenever someone we trusted turns out to have a hidden side. A Jekyll and Hyde. We think we know it. Respectable doctor, monstrous alter ego, a magic potion. But almost everyone remembers the wrong lesson. The horror of this book is not that a good man was invaded by a monster from outside. It is far worse and far closer to home. The monster was always inside, with his own key, waiting for permission. This is the story of the man who gave it to him, and of the night the door would not lock again. The book is Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, published in 1886 by Robert Louis Stevenson, a frail, tubercular Scottish writer who, by legend, dreamed the central scene in a fever, and after his wife criticized the first draft, burned the whole manuscript and rewrote the novel in a matter of days. It arrived into the most respectable society the world has ever staged. Late Victorian London, where a gentleman was expected to be pious, sober, and spotless in public, whatever he did once the curtains were drawn. It was an age built on the double life, outward virtue over private appetite, and Stevenson saw straight through the varnish. His narrator is a dry, decent lawyer named Utterson, a man who makes a policy of never judging his friends too closely. Of his own live and let live creed, he says quaintly, "I let my brother go to the devil in his own way." Hold on to that line, because it is the quiet engine of the whole book. A whole polite society agreeing not to look too hard at what respectable men do in the dark. That is why the story survived to become a household phrase. Stevenson was not writing about one freak doctor and his chemistry set. He was writing about the architecture of every civilized person. The bright, presentable front room we show the world, and the locked cellar underneath that we swear, to everyone including ourselves, is empty. He wrote it as a shilling shocker to sell at a railway stall, and accidentally wrote the truest map of the modern self we have. Here is the whole novel in one sentence. A brilliant and respectable doctor invents a way to split off the worst part of himself into a separate body, so he can indulge every hidden appetite with no shame and no consequences, and slowly discovers that the self you feed in secret does not stay small, does not stay caged, and will not politely hand your life back when you are done. Dr. Henry Jekyll is not a good man corrupted. He is a man who could not bear the ordinary tension every one of us lives with, the gap between who we are supposed to be and what we secretly want, and who found a shortcut around it. Instead of integrating his darker half, he amputated it and gave it a name, Edward Hyde. The tragedy Stevenson builds, with terrible patience, is that you cannot amputate a part of yourself. You can only give it its own front door, We will walk it in 5 beats. First, the 2 selves and the fantasy of splitting them clean. Second, the man at the door and why strangers recoil from Hyde on sight. Third, the potion and the intoxicating taste of total freedom. Fourth, the night that freedom becomes a murder no one meant. And fifth, the moment the second self stops asking permission and simply takes over. Watch how each beat is really about a choice you make every time you open a second, secret tab on your own life. First beat, the 2 selves. Dr. Jekyll, Stevenson tells us, is a large, handsome man of 50, distinguished, wealthy, respected, the very picture of Victorian success. But inside, he carries what he calls a certain impatient gaiety of disposition. Appetites and pleasures he judges far too undignified for a man of his standing to be seen enjoying. So he does what respectable people have always done. He hides them, and he despises himself for having them. Years of that quiet war between the presentable self and the buried self lead him to a discovery he comes to regard as the deepest truth of human nature. He puts it in a single line that is the spine of the entire book. He has learned, he says, to recognize that man is not truly one, but truly 2. Not a good soul with a few flaws. 2 genuine selves sharing one body at war. And Jekyll's fatal idea is this: if these 2 could be separated, each housed in its own identity, then the upright twin could walk through life free of shame, and the darker twin could do exactly as he pleased without ever staining the good name of the other. It is the oldest fantasy there is, and you run a small version of it constantly. The polished professional on the work call and the person snarling at traffic 10 minutes later. The gentle profile photo and the anonymous comment left at midnight. We are all quietly managing 2 selves and praying the seam holds. Jekyll's sin is not that he has a Hyde. We all do. His sin is believing he can keep the good of himself clean by shipping the rest of himself off to live somewhere else. The takeaway: the self you refuse to own does not disappear. It just stops being under your control. Second beat, the man at the door. We meet the dark twin before we understand him, and Stevenson is careful to show us Hyde first through the eyes of ordinary strangers. A man named Enfield describes watching Hyde calmly trample straight over a small running child in the street and walk on, cool as ice, leaving the girl screaming on the ground. What haunts everyone who meets Hyde, though, is not any single scar or feature. It is a wrongness they can feel, but cannot name. As Enfield puts it, struggling for words, there is something wrong with his appearance, something displeasing, something downright detestable. People loathe Hyde on sight and cannot say why. And crucially, Hyde comes and goes through a battered side door of Jekyll's own respectable house, the back entrance to the good man's life, where the hidden self slips in and out unseen. Think about how exactly that maps onto the world you live in now. The anonymous account with no face and no name that exists only to be cruel. The stranger in the comments who tramples a real human being and scrolls on without a flicker of feeling. We have built an entire architecture of side doors, burner accounts, private tabs, throwaway handles, precisely so the detestable version of us can go out, do harm, and slip back in before anyone connects it to the respectable name on the front of the house. And everyone can feel the wrongness of it, even when they cannot name the point. The takeaway: When you give your worst self its own door, it does not stay polite. It goes looking for someone to trample, precisely because it believes no one will ever trace it home. Third beat. The Sea of Liberty. How does an upright doctor become that man at the door? With a drug of his own making. Jekyll compounds a chemical potion, drinks it, and feels his body shrink and twist into something younger, smaller, and utterly free. Edward Hyde. And here is the part almost everyone forgets. The first thing Jekyll feels is not horror, it is joy. A wild, delicious relief. Listen to how he describes the freedom of stepping out of his respectable self. I was the first that could thus plod in the public eye with a load of genial respectability, and in a moment, like a schoolboy, strip off these lendings and spring headlong into the sea of liberty. Read that again, because it is the most seductive sentence in the book. To be rid for one night of the weight of your own reputation. To act with no name attached, no record, no morning after. That is not a dusty Victorian fantasy. It is the exact promise of the anonymous internet, the secret account, the trip where nobody knows you, the whispered idea that the real you only comes out when no one is watching. Stevenson understands the pull of it completely. He does not pretend the temptation is weak. The freedom is real, and for a while it is glorious. But notice the metaphor he chose, a sea. You do not stand in a sea, you are carried by it. And a man who springs headlong into the water to feel free has also, without quite noticing, stopped being able to touch the bottom. The takeaway, the thrill of a self with no consequences is genuine, and it is exactly how the current gets its hands on you. Fourth beat. The night it becomes murder. For a while, Jekyll keeps the arrangement in balance. Hyde for pleasure, Jekyll for respectability, the potion a door he can open and close at will. But Hyde is growing. Each outing leaves the doctor a little less in charge, and one moonlit night, in a fit of pure cruelty, Hyde beats a gentle old man named Sir Danvers Carew to death in the street with a heavy cane, clubbing him down for no reason at all. There is no motive, no gain, no provocation, only the joy of harm. And this is where Stevenson refuses to let us feel safe, because when Jekyll finally examines the thing he has released, he does not describe a wounded soul or a misunderstood outcast. He writes it plainly. And Edward Hyde, alone in the ranks of mankind, was pure evil. That line is the trap at the center of the book. It would be comforting if Hyde were an alien, an infection, something that came from outside. But Hyde is not a stranger who invaded Jekyll. Hyde is a distilled piece of Jekyll himself, refined down to raw appetite with the conscience boiled off. The horror is ownership. Every cruel thing Hyde does, the respectable doctor did, because they are one man. We do the same disowning every day, in miniature. The cruelty typed and then blamed on being tired. The harm done under a fake name and quietly filed under not really me. But the hand on the cane is always your hand. The takeaway, the evil you assign to your other self is not a separate person taking the blame. It is you, with the lights off, hoping the name will not stick to you. Fifth beat. The moment it stops asking. Here is the turn that makes Jekyll and Hyde not a monster story, but a story about addiction, and about every habit that begins as a choice and ends as a master. At first, Jekyll has to take the potion to become Hyde, but as the months pass, the balance quietly reverses. He begins to wake as Hyde, without having taken anything at all. The dark self surging up on its own, uninvited, in his sleep. To stay Jekyll now, he has to keep dosing himself. The respectable self, once the effortless default, becomes the exhausting thing he has to work to maintain. Of the change, he says grimly, "My devil had been long caged. He came out roaring." The years of feeding the secret self in the dark did not shrink it. They fed it into something stronger than the man who made it. And then the final horror. The specific chemical he needs to turn back runs out, and no fresh supply will work. Some impurity in the original batch, impossible to reproduce. Jekyll is trapped. He can feel Hyde rising for the last time, permanently, and he writes his confession in the narrow hours before he loses himself for good, then takes his own life rather than let Hyde be dragged to the gallows in his place. This is precisely the shape of every addiction and every double life that curdles. The thing you kept as a private escape slowly becomes the thing you cannot escape. The tab you opened for relief becomes the room you now live in. The takeaway: whatever self you feed in secret is the self that eventually wins, and it does not give the body back. So what does all of it add up to? On the surface, Jekyll and Hyde is a gothic shocker, a mad scientist potion, a shrunken monster, a murder in the fog, a locked laboratory door. But underneath the horror machinery, Stevenson is running one unbearable experiment on a decent man, and every beat we walked is a stage of it. He begins with the two selves and the seductive fantasy that they could be cleanly split, the good name kept spotless while the appetites are shipped off elsewhere. He shows us the man at the door, the disowned self that strangers recoil from and cannot name. He lets us feel the genuine intoxication of the potion, the sea of liberty, the joy of acting with no consequences at all. Then he turns it. The freedom becomes a murder no one meant, done by a self the respectable man insists is not really him. And finally, the caged thing comes out roaring and will not go back, until the man who thought he was in control is the one begging for the body he gave away. Put it together, and Stevenson's verdict is quietly devastating. The problem was never that Jekyll had a dark side. Everyone does, and pretending otherwise is its own kind of lie. The problem was that he tried to solve it by splitting instead of owning, by building his monster a private door instead of keeping him in the same house, under the same name, answerable to the same conscience. What you disown, you do not defeat. You only set it loose. Here is the one thing to carry out of this book and into your week. You are not one clean self with an unfortunate dark passenger. You are, as Stevenson insists, at least two. And the work of a whole life is not to murder the second one, but to keep him inside the house, known and named and answerable to you. The danger Jekyll shows you is not having a Hyde, it is disowning him. It is the small, constant temptation to route your worst impulses through a side door, a private account, an anonymous cruelty, a version of you that comes out only where your real name cannot follow. And then to tell yourself that whoever did that was not really you. Every time you do that, you are not getting rid of the impulse. You are feeding it in the dark and teaching it that it will never be held responsible, which is exactly how it grows strong enough to come out roaring. So this week, do the opposite of Jekyll. When the ugly wish flashes up, or the cruel comment half types itself, or you catch the second self reaching for the potion, do not split it off and disown it. Notice it, name it as yours. Ask what it actually wants, and answer it in daylight, under your own name, where your conscience can still get a hand on the wheel. A dark side you own is just being human. A dark side you disown is Edward Hyde, out in the fog with your key in his pocket. Keep him in the house. That is the whole of the work. Robert Louis Stevenson, sick and feverish, wrote in a few white-hot days the definitive study of the divided self, a story so exact that we still borrow its two names for anyone whose hidden side breaks the surface. Dr. Jekyll got the wish our whole two-tabbed age keeps quietly making: a spotless public self and a private door for everything else. And Stevenson followed that wish without blinking all the way to the confession written in the dark and the small, twisted body on the laboratory floor. Own your Hyde, or one day he owns you. That is the whole of the bargain and the whole of its price. If this walk through Jekyll and Hyde gave you something worth keeping, subscribe. A new classic every week, faithfully, in about 20 minutes. Next time we leave the fog of Victorian London for something older, stranger, and far more playful. The ancient Chinese sage Zhuangzi, who fell asleep, dreamed he was a butterfly, woke, and asked a question that still cracks the mind wide open. Was he a man who had dreamed he was a butterfly, or was he now a butterfly dreaming he was a man? And tell me in the comments, what does your Hyde look like? The version of you that only comes out when no one can trace it back. I read every reply.